was off. So he moved to Colorado and left us alone here. No permission is asked. He just take himself and go. You can see that where there's no kibir in this place. So anyway, we will call him back, inshallah. He had authored a book with another professor talking about the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the white supremacist conspiracies, theories, and work toward that, and the effect and the implication on the Muslim community. So we thought, inshallah, this will be a good opportunity for our listeners and our remote listeners to take the lessons and understand the reality that's surrounding us. So we'll come you back, inshallah. Bismillah. What's the time? You have an hour.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakumullah khair. Can you hear me? So, Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursaleen. The book we authored has a story. It started with my colleague in a recent synagogue shooting in San Diego. A guy by the name of John Ernest went into the synagogue and killed Jewish worshippers. He was also responsible for torching a masjid. He burned a masjid. So my colleague, who was a longtime professor at Cal State Berkeley and Cal State Chico, he sent me an email, said, you know, it seems that these people are targeting both of our communities consistently. Is there a common thread? And we decided to look into it, and we found, in fact, there is a common thread. Conspiracy theories. When we look at these mass shooters in this book, the title of the book is Jews and Muslims in the White Supremacist Conspiratorial Imagination. We're looking at 5 or 6 mass shooters. These individuals targeted Jewish and Muslim organizations. We state immediately that we're not sure why they do it. We simply try to problematize some of the reasons, asking questions that haven't been asked before by other scholars looking at this issue. There's a strand of scholarship that looks at mass shooters in the following way. They say a mass shooter is someone who goes into schools, religious institutions, businesses, etc., and they will quantify for you how many people these individuals kill, what time they frequent these places, and some mental health issues that they might have. But this really doesn't tell us about this particular kind of mass shooter, the white supremacists that target Jewish and Muslim institutions. So what we did is we had to read their manifestos. Most of these mass shooters that targeted Jewish and Muslim institutions either live streamed their action, like Christchurch, New Zealand, or they wrote about it. And this is what the FBI has noticed since 2015, that there's an increase in what they called fame-seeking mass shooters. Meaning, traditionally, if you look at criminology historically, you understand that criminals try to hide their crime. You don't want to leave fingerprints, you don't want to leave DNA, etc. Now what they're doing is they're leaving something called the legacy token, meaning they're writing about it in a manifesto, or they're live streaming their action. Which begs the question, why would someone do that? Why would you want to become famous or infamous? And we had to go all the way back to their manifestos, and we talked to some of the New York Times reporters that investigated them, talked to their families and such, and one of them stuck out in particular. His name is John Ernest, this kid in San Diego. What was interesting is we find that he was addicted to the internet. Many of these guys, mostly male, white, were addicted to the internet. Much the same way that someone goes to the doctor for back pain and gets addicted to the internet, to opioids. It could be done by sheer accident. And many of these folks happened to get on these websites during the COVID era, when everyone was home and everyone was bored. So we look at the idea of boredom. So they go on these websites, they're bored. A friend might tell them about the websites, namely 8chan, 4chan, Gab, etc. These websites, these sort of almost dark websites, but they're prevalent among gamers, people who play video games. And we notice that on these websites, they're anonymous. And anonymity disinhibits people. It's as if you're intoxicated. When you're intoxicated through a substance, you lose your inhibition. You do or say things that you wouldn't otherwise do. The internet is unique in that it allows anonymity. It also allows people who want to be famous, want to be recognized, to try to do that, to get likes and to become famous, social media and such. So this guy lived in San Diego, John Ernest, liberal family, wonderful upbringing. He used to win renditions of Chopin music. He was a nursing student, wanted to help people. So he didn't check any of the boxes that we look at in criminology. Traditionally, we would say, well, this was a troubled kid, he was on drugs, he lived in a bad neighborhood, etc. None of these things actually fit this particular individual, as well as some of the others. So he gets on this website, 8chan, 4chan, and they start talking to other gamers. And he starts noticing that they're espousing conspiracy theorists about Jews and Muslims. Two prominent conspiracies exist. One is the sort of the old common conspiracy about Jews taking over the world. It's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's widely disseminated, a fabrication from the sort of Tsarist Russia long ago, made its way to the Middle East, made its way through Christendom. And one that recently came out that's authored by a lady who uses a pseudonym. She's actually Egyptian, Jewish. Her name is Bat Yor. And the name of her book is Eurabia, the Euro-Arab axis. Basically, the idea is that the Muslim Brotherhood is working with European nations and leaders to co-opt and undermine European existence and the way of life. And what's ironic is, of course, many of the white supremacists that target Jewish communities use her book, right, to justify the targeting of Muslim communities, not knowing that she's Jewish, of course. So the argument goes that in spite of evidence to the contrary, that these Arab regimes are working with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is clear contradiction of any historical fact. Most Arab regimes are, the worst enemy of these Arab regimes, and you can look at sort of Syria and Egypt and elsewhere, and you look at the Muslim Brotherhood and how they've been, excommunicated essentially, that these Arab regimes are working with this group to get rid of Western civilization. They cite things, and one Republican prominent senator, congresswoman cited something to the effect of, she said, I'm pulling my kids out of public school because they're serving hummus, a clear indication that Muslims are taking over. Right? It's what she called it, a gateway food to extremism. Right? So this is no longer in the fringes of these websites. This idea of Muslims taking over Western civilization has gone all the way up to the mainstream, to the White House and public policy and the media. But it exists in these corners. Now, these individuals, what we found out about them is they go into these websites to become anonymous. To become anonymous is to blend in with others like themselves. And so we have a rather controversial conclusion to our book, and I'm going to say the conclusion now. The conclusion is that the mass shooters that kill Muslims don't actually hate Muslims. We don't take them at their word, because they have to say that they hate Muslims. They have to say that they believe in this conspiracy. We're not suggesting that we're that they're not responsible for what they do. We're suggesting that there are other reasons why they do what they do. Because when we looked at their record and their history, and we spoke to the reporters and we read their manifestos, they never interacted with Muslims. They never interacted with the Jews. It would make sense, for example, for someone to say, well, look, when I was in high school, this Muslim kid stole my girlfriend. Or these Muslim kids beat me up. And I have a lot of animus towards them. Or when I served in the military, they killed my comrades, my colleagues. Not so. But they have to state these things so that they blend in on these websites. They find that these websites are all espousing these conspiracy theories. And so what you would do, imagine if you want to go and join a gang. I want to join the Bloods or the Crips. I want to join the Bloods. I don't go to the Bloods and say, look, tell me, is it true what you say about the Crips? Are they really bad? Are they this, that, and the other? Do I want to verify the claims? No, you wouldn't say that. To join, you say exactly what I know you say. The Bloods are bad, etc. They're professing the credo of the group because they want to be part of the group. And then when they join, what ends up happening is they begin to get socialized on these websites. So they socialize them in the following way. You start to espouse the conspiracy theories. We engage in what's called positive social reinforcement. So you're the man, good job, right? They start talking in the game of languages, in the language of games, excuse me. So for example, they talk about kill scores. Who's going to defend the white race? Who's going to defend the Christian white race? And who's going to get the highest kill score? They talk about it as if it's a game. And we found something else that's interesting, is they start to pass memes. How many of you here know what's a meme? A meme is a picture or a funny little quote or something. And it's a historical artifact. Memes have always existed. It's how we understand common ideas in society across time. But today, memes are passed around like mind viruses. And one of my colleagues published a chapter in one of my first book, looking at memes as mind viruses. So consider what a meme does. It infects a person's mind in the following way. You see a picture, you're a Republican, let's say, and you see a picture saying that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and it has a nice little funny quote. That meme enters your mind, but the intention of a virus is to do what? It's not to die, it's to do what? To spread. So it enters your mind, and the internet becomes the vessel by which you transform that meme into 100 other memes. You either make new ones, conveying the same message, or you simply send this along to your friends. And here's the funny thing. Sometimes, even if you're offended by the meme, you send it to your colleagues because it offends you. It offends your sensibilities. My God, look at this nasty idea. Look at what these people are sharing. And in so doing, what you've done is you've shared that meme with others. So it gets passed around, and because people don't fact check, people don't read information, it reinforces existing beliefs. It's a very quick way to reinforce existing beliefs. So what ends up happening is it infects you, you pass it along, and it infects other people. But a virus sometimes infects a host and kills them. And the argument is that these mass shooters are the hosts that eventually either die or get arrested trying. We don't know why they actually act upon it, but there's neurological literature that talks about the infection of the mind. It talks about, for example, how you go from a meme to a rally. You're in the street protesting for Donald Trump because perhaps other memes have infected you. You now say, I want to go and get more bumper stickers on the car. That's the idea of the meme, is to be passed around. Ideas get passed around in this way. So on these internet websites, these guys are passing around memes, talking about Muslims and Jews. And I always show a presentation of some of the memes that we talk about. And they buy into it. They essentially become radicalized. They go and they act upon it. They blend in with their peers, but then we take something from philosophy. There's a story called the Ring of Gyges. The Ring of Gyges is basically this. A man is walking around in the desert, and he falls into a crevice, and he sees a skeleton wearing a ring. And he puts on the ring, and he becomes invisible. When he becomes invisible, he goes from a poor shepherd to the next emperor. And the reason that he did that is he's able to do things that he couldn't otherwise do when he was seen by others. Now, the philosopher tells us this story to try to ask us the question, are we moral beings, or do we simply wish to seem that way in front of others? What would we do if we were invisible? And the internet allows for invisibility. So these chat rooms for our children, these places, these gaming websites, social media, etc., allows us to get that superpower that when we were young, we always wondered, what would it be like to be invisible? Now we're able to do that. And when you're invisible on the internet, you say things you wouldn't otherwise say in person, and you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do in person. And so that's what ends up happening. They become invisible to blend in. But beyond the blending in, they also have an ego issue. Remember what I said? What did I say? That the FBI is telling us since 2015, mass shootings are becoming fame-seeking mass shootings. People want fame and infamy. Remember I said, why else would you try not to conceal your crime? Because you live in a society of ego. You live in a society where people want followers. So now that they've hidden, now that they've worn the ring of Gyges and become part of the group, now the group begins to challenge them. Who's going to get the highest kill count? Who's going to take on these Muslims and Jews who are taking over our country and eliminating the white race? So they go now and they act upon it. In Canada, you have the guy who goes and runs over a Pakistani family. These guys go into mosques and synagogues, easily identifiable as institutions where Muslims exist. Because you see, they don't understand race. They don't go after a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslim. They go after a particular phenotype, an appearance of a Muslim. And here, we have something to say about who sends them these messages. It's not just the internet. People always blame social media. Social media is a conduit sometimes. Social media sometimes reacts to mainstream media. Post 9/11, Muslims went from what Edward Said called sort of the magical, the oriental, to the monster. Pre-9/11, a Muslim was someone who was riding on a carpet. A Muslim was someone who, you watch Aladdin, the genies, the belly dancers, etc., the exotic other. Still the other. It was a precursor to what the Muslim is now. Post 9/11, they're the monster. They even talk about them as a disease. They metastasize, sleeper cells. Just like cancer, they can metastasize. They can be your next door neighbor. Now, who gave us that message? Who told us who we're supposed to fear? The media. And that's how Islamophobia functions largely. It's what we call high fashion hatred. See, these individuals, if the group to fear was Mexicans, that's who they would be after. If the group to fear were Martians from Mars, that's who they would be after. But who told them whom to hate? Public policy, the leaders on high, the people that say, that condemn this kind of violence are the people that really set the stage for who these people are that you're supposed to hate. And this is how they appear. They're shown on the media time and again. In the 1980s, when it was the war on drugs, it was black equals crack. If you turn on your television, it was the crack baby epidemic, and it was often a black woman that was shown, or a black man, and the whole idea of the sort of the black criminal starts in the 1980s. But who perpetuated that idea? It's this idea of instilling fear in the public. So what did you do? The media gives us this image of the black criminal, and then you go and you vote. White middle-class America goes and votes. But it's not like they're voting out of their own volition. They're voting because they're influenced by public policy, by the media apparatus. So they go and they vote for increased punishments for African Americans. And that gives us sort of the skyrocketing numbers of those blacks that were incarcerated until this day. We went from maybe 140,000 in the prison population to over close to 2.5 million now under the grips of the criminal justice system, the vast majority of them African Americans. That parallel exists with Muslims today. So you homogenize, you create this image, this abstract image of a Muslim, and abstract is an important key. It's a silhouette, it's a figure, but you never actually fill in the details. And most people, of course, we count on the idea that most people don't interact with Muslims. We constitute less than 1%. So if we don't interact with them, you're always that figure, never given humanity. I don't see the humanity in my fellow Muslim because I don't interact with them. I don't see the details. And there's a great study called Islamophobia without Muslims. And they look at Eastern European countries, and they look at Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and they want to understand why Islamophobia is more prevalent in Eastern Europe. And the argument is precisely because they have far fewer numbers of Muslims. They don't interact with them. That's not to suggest that Western Europe is a bastion of liberalism and acceptance, no. But it's the idea that when you don't interact with them, where is your image about, what your stories about these people, where do they come from? They come from this abstract idea given to us by the media. So that high fashion hatred, the thing that is in vogue, gives signals to the individual prejudice whom they're supposed to hate. And then they go and they act on it, and they act on phenotype. They act on the idea of who these people are supposed to look like. I did want to say one thing with respect to this. If you look at mainstream criminology, we have a bunch of theories that try to explain why these individuals become criminals. One of them is very famous. It's called differential association theory. The idea that I meet a group of people that are bad as a youth delinquent, and they socialize me. They teach me how to steal cars. I wasn't born knowing how to steal cars. I wasn't born knowing how to use drugs. They socialize me. So they'll say, good job, you're the man, etc., when I keep doing these things. And the things that they're socializing me to accept are different than the mainstream conventional norms. Conventional norms say don't steal cars, but I need acceptance because I don't have a father, I had a bad upbringing, I grew up in a bad neighborhood, etc. I look for acceptance from my peers. And the more they socialize me in this way, the more I become sort of deviant, if you would. That doesn't hold here for these mass shooters. Again, this guy, especially John Earnest, very good, very involved in his school, winning awards, etc. Not so. The only thing that makes it different is the internet. That's where he begins to get this idea of socialization. Other theories, like subculture theories, look at subcultures of violence. They looked in Chicago, the Chicago School of Sociology was asked to deal with the immigrant problem. They said these immigrants are coming in and they're essentially not being socialized to accept American norms, mainstream norms. So you see their kids running around in the streets, etc. Blacks are more violent. This was after the use of the census to create the black criminal. So they created something, a bunch of guys, Marvin Wolfgang and others, created something called subcultures of crime, subcultures of violence, excuse me, in which they say that in order to cope with the harsh inner city life, people develop these kind of characteristics, dog eat dog, be tougher than the next guy, etc. And they socialize their children accordingly, they pass it down. Now, fundamentally, some of these theories were rather racist because they were implying, of course, that African Americans were more inclined to violence than others. And they failed to address the problem of why is it that these conditions that these people are having to, fight their way through. Did you talk about the conditions, the economic system that creates these conditions? They neglected those kinds of important questions. So Is this socialization? Not so for these people. As I said, middle-class American values, in the case of the American shooters, a liberal upbringing. So it's not like they were in these kinds of conditions that we would expect. So these people go in and they shoot. Internet memes, internet addiction. I have a great set of memes here. I wish I could show it to you. We think that they don't actually hate blacks, they don't hate Jews, they don't hate Muslims. That's a very controversial statement. Now, they claim in their manifestos that they hate Jews, Muslims, blacks, and others. But when we look at their history, we notice that there's no interaction with these people. Could it be that we don't take them at their word? Could it be that they simply wanted what we call recognition hunger? That they want to be recognized? Remember, they were being dared by their friends to do what? To go and who's going to be man enough to get the highest kill count? And they disappeared at once, but then they had to, I'm sorry? Oh, walaikum salam. But then they had to make themselves known. So they disappeared among the group, now they have to stand up and make themselves known because it's recognition hunger. Because in a society where anyone has a cell phone and social media can become important, can have a following, why is it that I'm not followed? Why is it that I'm not famous? And how can I become famous? I think it's very reductionist to say mental illness. I think in so doing, it helps us to sleep better at night. Oh, my children don't have mental illness, so they're immune from this. No. In fact, in the study of mental illness, they looked at mass shooters and mental illness. 68% of those who engaged in mass shootings had no form of declared sort of mental illness. Moreover, most of those people who do have mental illness don't actually become violent. So what explains this particular group's inclination to actually act upon their professed hatred? A lot of people play video games, so I would never suggest to you that it's video games, although it's a component here because they talk about the language of video games. They spread the most vile memes about Muslims and Jews. When the mask mandate was going on, you'd see a person with a mask, and then you'd see a woman in a burqa, and they would say, well, see, this is the Islamization of the US and the Western world. It's the Muslims that are pushing for the mandate of the mask so that we can appear this way. Conspiracism is really about, and I think this is an important subject for us to talk about, because unfortunately I've noticed through my engagement with the Muslim community, both here and in Colorado, there's a lot of belief in conspiracy theories. This takes me to another book. There's a great book called Eric Hoffer's True Believer. And he says basically that he actually talked about Mohammedans, Muslims. He said if you go to those countries, you'll find there's a great deal of emphasis on magic and black magic, and et cetera. He said that is a way for people to avoid personal responsibility. Well, my daughter said they got divorced, must be magic. Or maybe they weren't socialized properly to deal with a partner, right? So he says in societies like this, individualistic societies, we have to make distinctions between this kind of a society and communal societies like ours. Conspiracy serves a purpose. Belief in conspiracy. All of us are conspiracists at some level. In the university, I can go next door to the professor next door and we can say, these administrators, I bet you that the policy that they did is because of X, Y, and Z. I'm not sure of it, but it's a form of conspiracism. It allows us to be certain. It gives us certainty in an uncertain world. And so when you say, well, it's the Muslims that are doing this, it avoids the hard work and the difficult work of doing what? Actually investigating, why is this happening? Why are prices increasing? And so on and so forth. So it's a very simple answer. So I found a lot of Muslims are subservient to this kind of thinking as well. In the US, as he says, Hoffer, and in Western societies that are individualistic, if you fail, it's your own doing. It's your own failure. One way to avoid that label of being a failure is to join a group. So if I join the Trump supporters, if they're on top, I win. I'm with the winners. If they lose, it's not my fault. We all lost collectively. It takes away, in a society that blames the individual, it takes away personal responsibility, right? So belonging to a group, the need to belong. So that's one of the things that we noted with these shooters, that they go into these websites because they have to belong to a group. With respect to? Yeah, you know, Sigmund Freud talked about he called it the narcissism of minor group differences. So basically, you know, it's you have the need to belong to a group is the need to extend your own. What did he call it? The projection of oneself into the group. You project yourself into the group, so the successes of the group are your own successes. It's a psychological mechanism. I'm with the winners. And he said, Paul and Saul in the Bible are the same people. That is to say, that if you can be a communist one day and a fascist the next, you just simply move from, you see these people losing, you go to this other group. I'm with the winners. And it's a way for you to feel better about yourself. It's a psychological mechanism. When he talked about minor group differences, he said, even in the same group, for example, Americans, Christians, you have the Yankee and the Southerner. They look alike, they practice the same faith. What ends up happening is, I want to belong to a group that's winning. Or I want to identify with the group because that identity is a projection of me. So when people vote, what are they doing actually? They're projecting themselves into that leader. They're saying that the qualities this person has is what I believe are good. This is what I value. This is what I cherish. It's nothing more than what Freud would call projection, projecting yourself onto this other person. And the collective group and the identity. So when you say I'm a Trump supporter, what does that mean exactly? I can guess this is what you mean. These are the things that you believe in. These are the values that you adhere to. And conversely, the same is true with the opposing side, right? So this is this idea of projection. Does that answer the question? Well, that's the question. He wasn't diagnosed clinically, so I can't answer that question. I mean, when we spoke to the New York Times reporters, when we looked at their manifesto, it said there was no clinical diagnosis, and the New York Times reporter spoke with his parents. So we know that there's, as far as we're concerned, there's no clinical diagnosis. But again, perhaps it makes us feel at ease when we say, well, they were, you know, mentally deficient or some such thing. No, he was actually a scholarly individual. He was doing really well in school. You know, it's a simple answer to a very complex question. Perhaps, as we suggest, it's the idea, the need to identify with a group, coupled with the need, you know, for him, it's the white race. The white race is, of course, something that's an abstraction. And this is an important, you bring up an important point. But before I get to it, you know, he wants to identify with the white race, but he also wants infamy, recognition hunger. I want to be recognized. I blended in with the group. I've become invisible. But now I need to stand up and show the world that I'm important. Follow me. They, in fact, talk about this in their manifestos. Say again? A desire to be famous, which is something that's a byproduct of not just the natural human condition, but certainly it's significantly much more augmented now with social media. Everyone wants to be recognized, everyone wants recognition, etc. But this idea of whiteness, to belong to a white race, He's protecting the Christian race. He's protecting the white race. That's what he says. And that's why we question these motives, because the argument is, do we take them at their word for what they say, or are they simply saying what the group expects them to say? And we found that they even borrow and cite from each other. So, for example, John Ernest looks at, what's the guy's name? Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch killing, and then you have the New Zealand, the New Zealand massacre and so forth. They cite each other's work, and they encourage others, go make memes, go become famous, go do this, and they're daring one another to get the highest kill count. But going back to this issue of belonging to the white race is an abstraction. The white race, actually white supremacy, because we do call this Jews and Muslims in the white supremacist conspiratorial imagination. I'm writing another book now on a theory of Islamophobia. But with respect to whiteness actually does not exist. It does, but it does not. White supremacy is prevalent precisely because it's absent. We don't see it. We don't examine it. We talk about Black History Month. We don't talk about White History Month. And now there's more of a push to talk about white history. Let's talk about exactly the things that you've done as a white race. Since you want to be identified as white, let's talk about what that looks like, right? It's the ubiquity of whiteness, the existence, it's ever present. That's what makes it so strong. For example, I tell my students, when you write a paper, what's it supposed to look like? You have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Where does this come from? Has this been the way humanity has always written? No. This comes from a Eurocentric perspective, but that's the way to write papers. My son was telling me, Dad, you're not supposed to put your elbows on the table when you eat. I said, according to whom? Taking him this idea that this is proper etiquette or professionalism, professional attire. In the Black circles, the Black community, they've talked about this for some time. This idea that your hair is not professional. If you're wearing dreadlocks, for example, if you're Black. According to whose standard? Right? So you have to ask those questions to begin to study and identify what white supremacy looks like. And I think they've gotten away with it for a long time precisely because it's been so ubiquitous. It's always existed that it's never been studied. And I think now people are pushing back on it. So. Not really. You know.
So what I'm saying is, the white supremacist, it is in his, it was there all along, and
Oh, I like white privilege.
yes, and he want to show his superior, superior to everything else, but could not do it right while he is doing what he was doing in school and the work and the church was having. But when he was, what you said, when he was gaming and interacting with the internet, he found open wall there, open things. He became much more pronounced player.
Maybe. Look, there's been studies in the prison. In the prison, they talk about the experience of different minorities. If you want to study people like you study mice under absolute control, then you study the prison system. And they wanted to understand how is it that blacks exist in prison, what's their experience, what is the experience of Asians, natives, and others. And when they looked at whites, they have no collective identity outside of the prison because it is all white. And so, but the assumption that you're making is that there's a thirst to compel that identity on others, which is already the predominant sort of paradigm. When you hear racists talk about universities that are HBCUs, black universities, how come they get to have black university? Well, every other university is white, by definition. Historically, every other university is white. Naam, if you have questions, please go ahead. I just wanted to mention something else. Go ahead.
Two questions. Why it's a male issue and the females are not part of it? And secondly, what was the impact of Donald Trump on this movement?
With respect to male and female, that's a question that criminologists have tried to answer for a long time. Despite the issue of mass shooters, they want to understand why female criminology has increased, criminality, excuse me. And they looked at some theories through a feminist paradigm, meaning, is it because of women's liberation that now women are out in the workforce? And if they're out in the workforce more, they're being socialized and sort of certainly being exposed to more risk-taking behaviors. So take more risks. And thus that leads to more opportunities also for crime and engaging in crime. Now that doesn't answer the mass shooting question, but it certainly addresses the issue of female criminality in general. That's one way to look at it, right? They're being exposed to more opportunities to engage in crime. They're being asked also to contribute to the household, so economically they become, sort of responsible. Those pressures, there's a theory called anomie theory that says social pressures exist on all of us. And some of us who don't have the conventional means to attain those successes. For example, if we define success as financial success, material success, well, look, my father isn't an attorney or a doctor or whatever. I don't have those connections in the social networks to engage with others and to get mentored by others in these professions. I can't make it to school, etc. I grew up in the hood. I grew up in a place where I saw the most successful person was the drug dealer. The person that came and bought me sneakers at the beginning of the school year. That's the person whom I idolize. That's the person who I'm going to emulate. So with regard to women, these social pressures exist. You now have to contribute to the household. I'm not making it through conventional norms. I don't have the same connections. I'm going to prostitute. I'm going to, dance. I'm going to do whatever it is I have to do to survive in a dog-eat-dog kind of world. So that's one explanation that criminology offers. What was the second question, Afwan?
Yeah, but still the first question, why there are no mass shooters, white mass shooters?
No answer. I mean, there's such a few, the same would hold for serial killers. Why are there so few women serial killers? One argument that was put forth, hypermasculinity. A Freudian example, for example, Sigmund Freud looks at what's going on with, or would look at what's going on, and this idea of toxic masculinity, having machine guns and releasing sort of a sexual release for Sigmund Freud, releasing bullets, releasing aggression. For him, it's a sexual issue. Depending on who you talk to, they might give you a different explanation. I would suggest to you that it's very much tied to other issues in criminality. They're not engaged in the gaming culture as much. They're not they're not socialized in the same way that these people are. And that's my answer, personally. There are certainly a growing number of women that are going into jails and prisons, but for petty offenses, drug offenses, Give you an example. Post-1980s, the war on drugs, who was being locked up the most? African Americans. And whom from African Americans? Males. Who does that leave behind to take care of the households? And households that were already problematic because there was no, they were disadvantaged because of redlining and so on. Structural racism. So who do you think is now engaging in similar kinds of offenses, drug-related offenses, to maintain those households? We're finding that they're incarcerating more and more African American and Hispanic women as a result of the war on drugs, because they've eliminated a large segment of the male population, 18 to 35. They have decimated the African American community. One criminologist by the name of Michael Welch, talks about this. He said, what happens to a group of people when you take the youngest of them, the sort of the most robust age category, when they're contributing economically to the household, 18 to 35. What happens when you take them and you lock them up, post-Jim Crow? You ensure that their children are going to they're going to have a significantly more likelihood of encountering the criminal justice system because they don't have the role models, they don't have the resources, etc. I would argue the same holds true for women. So I don't have an answer for you. The long and short of it is that I don't have an answer for you. I know that women's criminality is on the rise. They're being more represented as criminals. I don't know why, with respect to mass shooters, they haven't caught up. Donald Trump, I think, this is not unique to me or to anyone else. I think I've heard this, spoken by others. He's symptomatic of America's underbelly. He simply allowed people to project who they are into someone who's saying what they wish they would say. No doubt he's a white supremacist, self-avowed white supremacist. He has given permission and license to these individuals to say what they were formerly hiding. You said I come from Colorado now. Colorado had a rally of about 8,000 Klansmen on a place called, it's one of these local mountains there, right outside of Denver. And I was attending an author who was talking about this book, The History of the Klan in Colorado. The sheriff was a member of the Klan. The airport was renamed. They actually closed the airport down, and the entire section of town was called Stapleton. He was a self-professed Klansman. I mean, he was very deeply entrenched. White supremacy has existed in various forms. He just gave permission for it. And so these people were emboldened by it, no doubt. But then the question arises, well, how come not every white person is doing the same thing? Or white Republican, MAGA Republican. Why aren't they doing the same thing? It's the same argument that holds when we look at video games and so on. Well, they're all on video games. Why aren't they all acting on them? So he gave them license to appear. I mean, you saw the Charlottesville rally. They saw their group coming out, and they were emboldened by this. Again, this sense of belonging to a group, I would argue. Yeah. Anything else? The takeaway is, the first study I looked at was about Diya Barakat, Allah yarhamu, him and his Yusr Nazan. We presented the research in New Orleans. We were looking at Marvin Wolfgang, this guy who talked about victim precipitation. Victim precipitation is one of two things. Victim precipitation means you contribute to your own demise. And there's active precipitation, meaning if I know I'm in Klan country and I'm black, phenotypically black, walking in that area is going to endanger me. I might die, and it's controversial because some people said, well, look, this is victim blaming. You're blaming the victim for... No, he's just simply suggesting to you based on his analysis, based on what he's done. And he used to ride with the police officers, homicide detectives, looking at homicide specifically. If I am victimized there, it's because I precipitated my own demise. I knew this was an area that was problematic, or walking in downtown Raleigh, 3 o'clock by the nightclubs, 3 in the morning, etc., unprotected. And this is common, sort of common sense. You precipitated your own demise. In the context of active precipitation, I walk in on my lover, my wife, or some significant other, and they're engaged in an affair. I turn around and I walk away. The alternative is that I confront the person, and if I confront the person, this is what he found during his reports, his analysis. When people were murdered, they often engaged in an activity that put them in a way that, they precipitated their own demise. Now here's the takeaway for Muslims. You saw that post 9/11, women started taking off their hijab. You saw that Diyat's wife, he didn't really bother Diyat in particular, this guy, until his wife showed up. Then he made comments about her attire. She was phenotypically Muslim. She was visibly Muslim. I don't know what that means for us. I don't know what the attire means for us in Western civilization. Ibn Taymiyyah was quoted as saying, if you can appear like others to make da'wah, and it won't, appearing foreign to them when you're in non-Muslim lands, puts up a barrier between you and them. Prejudice, this is how prejudice functions. So he said, if you can adhere to Islamic stipulations, be Muslim, adhere to Muslim stipulations, but don't look foreign to them. This is Ibn Taymiyyah saying this, understanding how prejudice functions. Prejudice is basically this. There's a great book by Gordon Allport. In 1954, when they wanted to understand why Nazis how they became what they became, there was a whole series of studies looking at prejudice, why people listen to authority, etc. And he said, look, prejudice is stereotypes. I have never seen a pit bull in my life, other than in the movies, and I see that the pit bull dog, the breed, is very vicious. All of a sudden, I see a pit bull in the park. What's my reaction? Fear. Paranoia. Why? I've never encountered, the dog might be very friendly. I've never encountered it. But this is stereotypes, because the mind has to compartmentalize. It can't deal with every situation by itself. That's stereotype. So stereotype is not a bad thing. It's a natural way for the mind to function. It becomes bad when you begin to put labels on groups based on those stereotypes. And so here's an interesting scenario. Muslims are lazy, or Muslims are lazy, let's say, or violent, because that's what I'm getting from the media. And then I interact with Muhammad at work, and I see that Muhammad he's a hardworking guy, he goes to his kids' soccer games, etc., etc. There's 2 ways I can deal with this situation. Cognitive dissonance, which is a function of the mind, of the brain, is to say, the new evidence that was introduced to me about Muhammad and these Muslims is wrong, and my old way of thinking is actually right. It's just that this person's unique. This Muhammad is unique, the group is still violent and so on. That's one way. The second way is to accept the new evidence and say, maybe I was wrong, and maybe these people are individuals with different behaviors, different characteristics, etc. What these white supremacists do, what the signal of the Islamophobe is to do, is to homogenize, to put the group together, and to give that group a particular set of characteristics. Bat-Yor, the lady that published the book Eurabia, she said the Muslim has a particular trait that's born into them. It's called the jihad trait. They're violent. This was done with the Jews, with the racialization of Jews. Hitler could not have burned Jews if they converted to Christianity. But the philosophers of the 19th century turned Judaism from a religion to a race. So I say, I'm Syrian, you're Turkish, he's Jewish. Doesn't make sense. When did this happen? Around the 19th century, the racialization of the group. And unfortunately, we do this to ourselves. We speak about ourselves as a monolith, which in the sense of an ummah, we are. But our level of belief is different. Our practice of belief is rather different, even if it's nuanced. But when we monothelize ourselves like this, they take a cue also from their white supremacist leaders and others that these people are all the same. And what is it about these people? They're violent, they're prone to violent tendencies, etc. And they generalize about the group. And that's a way that says, and especially the phenotype. When Islamophobia's emphasis is on the Arab. Islamophobia's emphasis is on the Arab. It's not the Polish Muslim. It's not the Texan Muslim, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy. It's not the African-American Muslim, who, unless you knew that they were Muslim, they were African-American. But that's a different story altogether, because there you have an animus towards the black race, and there's a long history there as well. So I think, I don't want to take up more of your time, but if you have any questions, happy to take them in the last 3 minutes or so. Now, Barakallah.
I'm just curious, how has the book been received by peers, by your colleagues, and by
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, it's received fairly well by colleagues. There were some colleagues at the Dartmouth and other Ivy League institutions that have written some nice reviews. You can read those online. But there's been, of course, some criticism, as you can imagine, with respect to the conclusion that they don't actually hate the people that they're killing. That's a rather controversial statement, but it's one that I certainly stick by. I don't mean to absolve them of their guilt. I'm suggesting that, do we take them at their own word? Even if they told us, yes, I do hate Muslims. Well, do you really? Based on what interaction? So I think perhaps you hate the silhouette of a Muslim. You hate the image of a Muslim that was created for you. You don't actually hate Muslims themselves. And I think that's the problem with Islamophobia. You never actually hate Muslims. My argument is, if you dealt with Muslims and you saw their individualism, their humanity, etc., you might hate a Muslim, but you wouldn't hate the faith of Islam, which has often sort of been racialized and culturalized. Does that make sense?
Inshallah, time for one more comment or question, and we will conclude because of the time for Salah. Any comment or question?
Barakallah feek.
Amin, barakallah feek, جزاك الخير. Barakallah fi juhudak.
Oh, you had something? One comment? Comment? Question? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. We have minutes.
I prayed Isha yesterday. It's okay.
okay, you come to this conclusion that hatred is not there. You stick by that. Okay, so then, what are you saying would be the solution?
I'm saying,
Or is that something you were looking at?
I will suggest to you that, again, the things that I think are determinative of this outcome were not necessarily hatred. I think it's the sense of an exaggerated sense of self, that the ego, the inflamed egos, that they want to be made infamous, that they want to be, recognized. So that's I think plays a central role in the analysis. Second, maybe secondary or tertiary to that is the idea that they want to belong to a group. When I was talking about black Muslim experience, etc., in the prison, blacks fare much better. This is a very controversial statement, but criminology has shown this over time. Blacks fare much better in the prison because it emulates the conditions where they came from. Whites have a significantly harder time in the prison, and that's why they join groups like the Klan or the white supremacist groups there, because they want a shared white experience which they didn't have outside. So I think this idea to belong to a group for them is rather important. In an era where I would argue intergroup threat is functioning quite well. That is to say, they may genuinely believe that their group is being marginalized, pushed aside. When they see, there's a lot of confirmation bias, I know we have to pray, but when they see someone Jewish producers in movies, when they see Muslims going into movies and to cinema and to banking, etc., it reconfirms for them the idea that these people are taking over. Actually, what the Jews and the Muslims are doing by going into these fields is just normal intergroup behavior. It's power dynamics. How can I get more represented? I have to go into these fields so that my group, that's the function of prejudice. Prejudice is good for the majority group because it allows us to say these people are garbage. But it's good also for the minority group because guess what? The minority group looks at other minority groups and says, hey, you and I are both excluded. How can we address this prejudice? And that's why my argument is if Trump really wanted to leave, didn't want Muslims in Congress and such, he should have left them alone. It's the exclusion that made them coalesce with other groups and fight back.
Barakallah feek, inshallah. Amin, hopefully we'll have more of you, inshallah, down the road. Jazakallah khair, barakallah feek. It's time for the adhan.